Hello and welcome to The Menu, Monocle Radio's food and drink programme. I'm your host, Chiara Rimella. Coming up, we leaf through a book all about the joy of cooking for others.
I think in the book I say cooking for people is an act of love, and I believe that. And I think that it can be that in a restaurant as well.
Also in the programme, we sample Estonia's finest wine bottles.
The berries that we're making the wine out of, blackcurrants, cherries, pears, apples, everything. So we've used them forever.
Plus, we head to Somerset to learn all about one hospitality venture's love for apples. All that here in The Menu on Monocle Radio. Running a restaurant requires a chef to think about a million things at once, from sourcing to managing teams and hitting targets. But the realities of the business shouldn't take away from the central instinct that leads most chefs into the profession. The pleasure in creating dishes for others to enjoy. That's the spirit at the heart of Cooking for People, a new cookbook by the chef at the helm of London's celebrated gastropub, the Camberwell Arms. In his book, Mike Davies has been especially generous with his approach, grouping his recipes into evocative menus that are both enticing and accessible for home cooks. From cold northern waters to bright clear days and dappled shade, his poetically titled menus take a cue from the seasons and are inspired by dishes experienced dining around Europe and the British Isles. Mike joined me in the studio to tell me more. I started by asking him if the book was born out of a desire to reconnect with the idea of cooking for people.
I feel like for me, certainly that was part of my journey. I think that Cooking for People as a title kind of summarises my approach to hospitality first cooking. So I think the idea of hospitality, the warmth of it and the generosity, the welcoming of people into your home is something that for me is lost sometimes in the kind of commercialisation of restaurants. Not always. In fact, sometimes you can go to a restaurant and feel very welcome, and more often than not, that is the restaurant which you will go back to, irrespective of whether the food is actually good. And I think that because the book is not a restaurant cookbook, but it's for the home cook, I feel like the title was a way of, as you say, picking up on the gentility or the like kind of softer side of like welcoming people into your home and also trying to enjoy the evening yourself. Like Cooking for People, I think in the book I say cooking for people is an act of love, and I believe that. And I think that it can be that in a restaurant as well. But you're right, the day in, day out grind can often get in the way of remembering that.
As a chef who writes a cookbook, it's tricky sometimes because you will know all of the processes and all of the things that make these things exceptional. And yet, this is one of the most approachable books I've actually seen in such a long time. Because one of the stresses, certainly that I have when someone's coming round and I have to cook something, is how to construct a menu. Like, how do I put these things together? What works with what? Yeah. And you've done that, which takes a load off, a huge load off. So the book is divided by season. That's and right. Then there's menus within that. My question to you then is not a simple one, but it is, how do you construct a perfect menu? Why do these things go together? As a restaurateur and also as someone who put these menus together for this book.
Okay, so I think it's an interesting question because of the split between the two, and I think there are different ways of approaching a restaurant menu and a home menu. Let's start with the restaurant menu. I think, first of all, in my opinion, a restaurant menu should always be an expression of what you want to eat. And in fact, that's the first and maybe biggest similarity with the domestic approach. I think that if you're making food that you want to eat, everybody will enjoy that and it will resonate because it feels authentic. And I think if you're making something for the sake of making it, it's never quite as good. So I think that's the first thing. And also, frankly, with a restaurant menu, you have other considerations like the kind of commercial viability. You do think a little bit about profitability of dishes, although that should never be a kind of principal factor. I mean, for me in the Camberwell Arms, for example, it's also a product of like what we can buy that's the best thing in season, and we do all of our own butchery and we're using kind of super high quality ingredients, and the idea is not to kind of dilute the intrinsic quality of the building blocks. So the menu is sort of a product of those things, if you like, but it also has to read in a very appealing way, and that's kind of the last part of the like restaurant approach, if you like. I think at home, and this is the thing I feel and I have always felt about myself, that although I am a chef and have restaurants, I don't really think of myself in that way. I've kind of always thought that my food is basically home food that I've had to like push across the line to get into the restaurant space. And so the book in a way was me being able to like relax and just like fully lean into the fact that people are going to be making this at home, and the level of detail isn't quite the same. But I also think that people can tend towards overcomplicating because they get caught up in the idea of something being a spectacle, or because of for any number of reasons. Also, I think if you're using multiple cookbooks to draw together a dinner party menu, which is usually the default way of doing things, you have multiple tones of voices, multiple different approaches to cooking and all of that, and I think it can be quite confusing. So in terms of writing a menu for home, I think the first thing, like I said, is food that you want to eat because you'll make it better. And the next thing, I always think through a seasonal lens with food, just because I think things in season are at their best when they're in the peak of the season. And I kind of go from there, and then I'll think about the direction of whatever it is that I'm thinking about cooking being. So, for example, there's some menus in the book that have a geographical slant, maybe slightly Italian or maybe slightly Middle Eastern. I'm not in any way a particularly authentic chef, but I think so that perhaps there's a kind of guiding overall schematic, if you like. But yeah, so like something you want to eat, probably something seasonal, and then kind of build around that. I mean, also, I think it's a good thing to start with one dish and go from there.
You said that one of the prerogatives is that it has to sound good, and certainly you have given some incredible names to these menus. I'll just read a couple of my favourites. My absolute favourite is definitely I've mellowed, but there's also Bright Clear Days, Dappled Shade, Cold Northern Waters, Burnished Centerpiece, and Bright Warm Days. I mean, those images are so striking and they're immediately conjured up in your mind.
I'm really pleased that you've touched on that. Thank you.
But I suppose, again, why did you decide to go for these types of evocative settings? And you say in the book also that the food tastes different when you eat it in a different setting.
I'm not sure of the science of that, but I think that there's definitely a romance attached to context. I think also, in a literal sense, the reason we decided this is because my editor and I were looking at the introduction for each chapter, because each chapter is effectively a menu, right? And there's a sort of introductory bit of text about the menu as a whole before there are like sub-introductions for the dishes and so on.
You did a lot of writing.
Yeah, but because I like writing. I enjoyed the process. But like the writing is in part a way of introducing you to the menu and how I've thought about it. The previous question was how I've thought about it, and the writing in the beginning of each chapter is how I've thought about it and what I think about it. So my editor was like, well, I wondered about, because I think we ended up with a Sunday lunch section, and there's one of the recipes is just called How to Cook a Rib of Beef. And it looked so good in the kind of mock-up that Steph, my editor, was like, well, but we were wondering about maybe like having a title page for each chapter, and how about picking a phrase from your introduction of each thing? And we went through it and we found all these little phrases, because I have a bit of there's definitely a kind of romantic notion of cookery throughout the book, because that is me, really. And so I think that the sentiments that the titles provide give you a lovely, evocative introduction and allow you to kind of relax into the process of learning about a simple menu and how it's curated. So I'm really happy that you've picked up on it. It's the first time I've been asked about it, and I wasn't sure because it felt a little bit like extra, almost quite like bombastic in terms of approach, but actually I quite like it. I think it's a nice kind of different touch. And it is, I guess it's a little bit of an artistic flourish, I suppose.
If you're an emotional cook, then I know that you'll have an emotional answer to this next question. Obviously, the book is divided by season. I say obviously because everything in restaurants nowadays kind of moves in that direction.
As it should.
But the book opens with summer.
Yeah.
But what is your favourite season to cook with?
So I think it's actually autumn, mostly because I feel like all of the kind of big hitters from the summer are actually best when they're approaching the end of their season. So I think like tomatoes, sweet corn, peaches, those things, after they've had an entire summer on the plant, they are at their best, they are sweetest, they are heaviest, they are most juicy and so on. And I think that at that time you kind of have the beginnings of like the desire to sneak butter into food and stuff like that. And I think the combination of the like last of the summer produce with the slightly colder evenings is a special time.
Also, I'm really intrigued by the fact that the menu that you say is one of the easiest in the whole book is actually a winter menu, which is surprising to me because as an Italian, I'm very comfortable with summer cooking, you know, because you just throw a couple of tomatoes on the plate, job done. Whilst winter scares me because there's all this slow roasting that needs to happen and all these ingredients that need a lot of time and care. Do you think that winter cooking can be easy? And how is this type of ease different from the summery kind of breeziness?
So I think probably I have an inherent skew here, which is to do with the fact that I've worked in a lot of pubs that kind of do the bulk of their trade in winter. So I come from a chef background of like cooking hearty, wintry food a lot. So perhaps that is naturally quite a little bit easier for me. I can't remember the menu that you're referring to, but I think it's the root vegetable gratin. But yes, I mean, that's a great example because it's the kind of situation in which you can put things into a dish and put it in the oven and forget about it, basically. And that's very straightforward, you know? I think like cooking doesn't get a lot easier than that because you don't... Also, it's like minimal washing up. The prep, I mean, obviously there might be a little bit of peeling or something like that, which you might not do in the summer, but like relatively speaking, it's very straightforward, very untechnical. It's really just about appropriate consideration in seasoning and things like that. Also, I think like once you get into wintry cooking and you start to use more butter or using cream or cheese or things like that, you've got things which the inherent richness of which really help you to like boost the overall flavour and kind of satisfaction of something, you know? So I think that helps.
The old trick.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned the pub there, though, and that to me, and the idea of the Sunday lunch is the kind of the British backbone of this book. But then at the same time, as you mentioned before, there's influences and certainly from lots of different places.
100%.
In the summer chapter, you lean very Southern European. Yeah. There's a lot of Italy in there, but also Greece. Yeah. I really enjoy in the I've mellowed chapter the idea that these different traditions can all coexist in one menu. How do you find that all these different influences have come together in your menus, both at the pub and then in your cooking?
So I think if I could just refer back to what I said earlier in terms of putting dishes on menus that you want to eat, right? So I think the thing is that's where it starts. And if it starts there and you're a chef and you're curious, then you're like, but why do I have to make things that just come from where I'm from? You know, initially it might bleed. You might be like, oh, well, I'll investigate European styles of cookery because of course we do, because, you know, how could you grow up in England and not enjoy Italian food or learn about Italian food? I mean, how many people haven't eaten a pizza or enjoyed a tomato sauce with pasta? You know, it's like it's an impossibility. So if your curiosity starts there, why should it end there? And the reality is that like I have the cultural background that I have, and I can rely on that to a degree, and I can certainly use that in my own experience and so on. But also, if I've got a chef brain and I'm starting to think about ingredients and cooking, I'm curious to find out how other people do things. And so I think that where possible, I've tried to make the most delicious version of something that I can, and historically certainly worried about the authenticity of it. But these days, I really don't. I just feel like that kind of the feeling of like proper geographical authenticity is such a kind of misnomer in food. Like really you just want something to be delicious, right? I mean, so for example, there's a recipe, I think that menu is a vegan menu. It has a roast spiced pumpkin, I think. Or actually, I can't remember. Is it that one or is it something else?
I can't remember myself now, but
oh no, maybe it's no, it's not. It's the seafood rice, and that's because there's like a sort of southern. It's like a sort of Mediterranean, almost like Portuguese inspired or like Balearic Island style, like soupy rice with lots of seaweed, and then like I think the dessert is like baked apple or something like that. I mean, it's really. I can't even remember where they go together. But the point is that I think historically I would have looked at that and been sort of a bit harder on myself about the fact that these things don't go together. But then as in geographically they don't, but in terms of flavour, it's like the kind of beautiful acidity of a baked apple slowly at the end of something like that is perfect. So why hold back because geographically there might be some kind of dogmatic problem.
Mike Davies there, speaking to me at Midori House. This is The Menu. It may not have a winemaking pedigree or reputation as shiny as France, Italy or Spain, but Estonia actually has a viticultural tradition of its own, which goes back to more than a century. Most of the bottles this cool Baltic nation produces are fruit wines, but as the climate changes, an increasing number of producers are having a go at making traditional versions from grapes too. A new generation of growers wants to transform Estonia into a wine destination. By working together, they have established the so-called Estonian wine route, which guides visitors around the country to sample its best tipples. We dispatched our Helsinki correspondent Petri Burtsoff to meet some of the vintners along the route. We join his journey on the island of Muhu in western Estonia.
Seems that somebody has left one cluster there in the harvest, and even a pretty big cluster. Let's take it. 2 of them even. Aye.
So these are the Rondo
This is
grapes.
Rondo. Yeah, very typical Rondo cluster, sort of quite, in a way, fat. The grapes are quite dark. They give a lot of color to the wine, and if I taste this, a lot of it's very ripe. But yeah, here we have some. This is Pinot Noir. This wine I know from the leaves already. Solaris has a little bit more green or light green color for the leaves, and
I've joined the winemaker Peke Eloranta on Estonia's Muhu island for a tour of his estate during the busy harvest season. He runs Luscher Matiesen, one of the 20 or so wineries that this Baltic nation of just 1.3 million inhabitants boasts.
yes, so we deal with cold climate viticulture, which means mostly that it's reasonable to grow these hybrid varietals, which often also are these so-called PV varietals, which are resistant to the fungus diseases. So our main grape varietal is a red one called Rondo, which we have here. For example, most of this plot, Rondo is from Germany. It is a red varietal giving like a nice fruity wine. It ripens a little bit earlier than the normal Vitis vinifera varietals, and that's why it's suitable for this climate. And also the cold tolerance is a little bit lower than for these traditional European wine trees, Vitis viniferas.
And then what about your white grapes and their varieties?
For the white ones, our main varietal is Solaris, also from Germany. That one is from Freiburg Wine Institute, also from the 70s. And it's both of these grapes are the most grown wine grapes in these new cold wine regions or emerging wine regions like Sweden, Denmark. Okay, England has already emerged, but of course there they grow also these champagne varietals. But Solaris is a nice, very fruity with even exotic tropical fruit aromas and flavors, and it ripens really well. And now the sugar level for the juice before fermentation reached up to about 21.9, which actually gives about 13 or more than 13% alcohol if I don't stop the fermentation for part of the batch earlier.
Estonia, located on the same latitude as southern Alaska, is one of the world's northernmost countries making grape wines. Its climate is tempered by the Gulf Stream and the Baltic Sea, but the cold weather still comes with its challenges for the winemakers.
The winter damage is not the main thing here. More it's a question about the summer, that how well the grapes will ripen, and the years there are big differences in the years. So in some years, but like I said before, every year I've been able to make wine, but it means that in some years you don't make the red wine and you add some sugar for the white wine to get the alcohol level that you want to reach. But in some years you don't have to add any sugar, meaning you don't have to subtilize, and you get sometimes even a little bit too much alcohol. So, but the challenges are definitely this summer.
We have about 700 or 800 different kind of berry bushes here.
While some Estonian winemakers such as Eloranta focus on grape wines, others believe that local berries that are native to Estonia can produce wines that are just as good, if not better. Allikukivi, located in southern Estonia, near the popular beach resort of Pärnu, is a great example. Their award-winning wines, made from the likes of green currants, chokeberries, rhubarb and quince, are served in many of the country's top restaurants. I joined Ott Hein, son of the winery's founders Raili and Roman Hein, for a tour of the large estate and some wine tasting.
So, and here we have the chokeberries. These are really nice black berries, and I think this is one of my favorite wines that we have. We use French oak from them as well. There is like really nice tannins inside, and they are really good with the meat and some, let's say, the Christmas is coming, and like the stews and everything. There goes really well with that, because in this little berry they have so much tannins inside. So
I can taste the tannins. It's quite a strong flavor. But I wasn't expecting this. I can taste that this works really well for a wine.
This is the rhubarb wine, and it's from 2021. And this was the first wine that we got ready when we moved here and starting to making the wine. So basically this is our first wine, and still this is the most popular wine that we have.
Let's try it.
Yeah, let's try it. Cheers.
Cheers. It's nice.
It is.
It's nice. It's because you hear the words rhubarb wine, you immediately think, okay, that's going to be like a sweet dessert wine. But not at all, no. This is medium dry, and tastes like a nice white wine, essentially.
As I told you this before, so this is the wine that get mixed up really often. It's like Riesling, because it's the high acidity, bit sweetness.
Next, I headed to the capital Tallinn to meet someone who knows a thing or two about Estonian wines.
My name is Martin Hansen. I'm a food and wine journalist at Delphi Media. I'm also a sommelier, and I've been doing this for, 15 years maybe a little bit more. In the olden times, everybody had some wine, going in some cellars, or for example in my grandparents' place, it was behind this huge TV. There was a blackcurrant wine was fermenting. So this knowledge has always been here, but now it's become more professional and it's legal now. So a lot of wineries have started. We also know the berries that we're making the wine out of. Blackcurrants, cherries, pears, apples, everything. So we've used them, forever. And so making wine of it is just another kind of way of giving them value. The grapes, it's a new thing, and it's a very kind of unique thing, as grapes shouldn't grow here, or they are growing here, but they shouldn't give this yield or taste or substance that you can actually make wine out of. But we are trying, and some wines are really good, but they have a long way of being really, really great. So at the moment, I think if you talk about Estonia and wines and wineries, I think the berry wines are the things that you keep in mind, and some really excellent things are being made. Still rhubarb wines, which are almost kind of Sauvignon Blanc-y, this crisp and kind of elevates you when you drink them, and green currant, which I actually didn't know was a thing. They're making some really good sparklings, and so quince, for example, apples, of course,
For Monocle in Tallinn, Estonia, I'm Petri Burtsoff.
Thanks, Petri. This is The Menu on Monocle Radio. Now it's time for the week's top food and drink headlines. Here is Monocle's Sana Jumani.
Doburoku, a once illegal Japanese alcohol, is making a comeback. The sweet, relatively low alcohol drink was banned at the end of the Edo period, when measures to prohibit homebrewing were implemented. While the practice is still illegal in Japan today, the government now allows for inns and restaurants located in special deregulation zones to sell the drink, and more bars are increasingly selling the tipple. IKEA has opened its first standalone store in London's Hammersmith. Fans of IKEA dishes can enjoy all of their favourites at this new location, including tomato and basil pasta, fish and chips, breakfast options, and of course, the famous meatballs. The restaurant also offers menu items from the bistro and cafe, like hot dogs and ice cream, at the same prices as in-store IKEA restaurants. And finally, the annual World's Best Vineyards Awards were revealed this week, with Spanish wineries performing especially well. Marques de Riscal in the Rioja region, known for its futuristic hotel and over 500 hectares under vine, snagged the winning title. Wine producers across the world were praised for their work too, with Chilean producer Vic taking the runner-up spot and Creation in South Africa coming in third. Those are the week's food and drink headlines. Now, back to Chiara.
Thanks, Sana. You're listening to The Menu. And finally, on today's edition of The Menu, we're heading to the southwest of England to get a taste of Somerset's most celebrated fruit, the humble apple. Apple cultivation and cider making play an important role in the county's agricultural history. Records of the practice in the area go back over 700 years, and it remains an integral part of the modern farming calendar, starting with the apple harvest in late autumn. One place that cherishes this tradition is the Newt. This hotel and country estate in the heart of the region was founded in 2019 by hoteliers Koos Becker and his wife Karen Roos. Centred around the 17th century Hatspen House, the site is known for its award-winning hospitality and its grounds fresh produce, which underscores its restaurant's soil-to-table approach. The jewel in its crown, though, are its bountiful orchards, which are celebrated annually with their Apple Day Festival. This programme's producer, Monica Lillis, went along to find out more about the Newt and its commitment to the land and local traditions.
It's a balmy autumn day and I've just arrived outside the Newt in Somerset. This hotel-cum-hospitality monolith opened its doors in my home county 5 years ago, and since then I've often driven past and been curious about its goings-on. The day I visit is a very special date in the estate's calendar, Apple Day, which is dedicated to celebrating the importance of orchards to Britain's physical landscape, as well as its culture. As I enter through an apple-covered archway, I meet with Arthur Cole, the head of programmes here. He starts by telling me about the role the soil plays in this regional farming tradition.
So we're really lucky here in terms of the geology of where we are, where Hatspen is. This is incredibly rich. About really in a 20-mile radius, you're looking at approximately 20 different stones. We're standing on Blue Lias, a dark bluish grey stone that's about 205 to 180 million years old. It's a sedimentary stone made up of limestone and mud, and then right there in contrast you have this golden sort of burnt marmalade in places stone of the Hatspen stone. And to understand the estate, it helps to understand the geology underneath your feet, because that determines your soil, and your soil then determines what you grow and whether or not it's a good place to grow apples.
We begin walking away from the estate's entrance and down into its uniquely curved walled garden. Arthur and I find ourselves standing on a curious boundary.
Now we're standing between Ireland and Scotland on the border. Yeah. so I guess for anyone, if we were trying to do this for any listeners, we would be looking out down at our feet, and we can see the names of Ireland and Scotland on pieces of stone. This means that the trees that are trained against the low fence in front of us, all apple trees, come from those areas. So for Scotland, we can see ones closest to us are things like Malus domestica, Thomas Jeffrey from Scotland, and then we've got some numbers, 2017-0264. That is the unique accession number for that tree. Why is it important to have a unique accession number? Because we're standing in a national collection. A national collection is essentially a registered living genetic repository, and we need to have good plant records and labels, because by having a national collection, anyone can turn up at any time and ask to see the records, to learn about the collection that we have.
After observing this impressive collection, Arthur and I jump on one of the estate's green golf buggies for a full tour of the 900-acre estate. Driving through, we spot rare glistening aquamarine fungi, some of the ground's resident free-roaming deer population, and of course the harvesters knocking apples off the vast traditionally grown orchards. We find a quiet spot to sit down, and I start by asking him how the tradition of Apple Day came about.
Apple Day actually is relatively recent. It was started up in 1990 by two apple aficionados. The first Apple Day was actually in Covent Garden. The idea behind Apple Day is to celebrate heritage varieties. Bear in mind there's over 7,500 named varieties of apples. Really, their ambition was to draw awareness to this variety, but also to encourage people in their local areas to celebrate it. This is really to raise awareness of your local area. So we're celebrating it here in Somerset. We've got 70 different cider apple varieties that where we've just driven through, actually, Monica, was our orchards. We're doing our part to hold on to that genetic diversity, which is relevant to our geographical area. But it's also a really good excuse to come and drink cider and eat apples and have some fun, all surrounded by apples and apple lovers.
When we walked into the Newt today, we saw bottles upon bottles of gorgeous apple juice and cider, as well as the cider mill, essentially. Could you tell me about, because you start from orchard to bottle, essentially, is what you do here, but could you talk me through the process of the cider making here at the Newt?
Absolutely. So it all starts off with a sense of place. And where we're positioned in Somerset, traditionally you would have grown bittersweet varieties. So we tend to say that we're bittersweet ciders here. Classic West Country cider is often considered to be slightly cloudy and still. So we take that, we use the apples that make a traditional West Country cider, but we treat the juice slightly differently. We treat the juice as though in the same way that a wine producer might treat the juice of their grapes. So we use when we apply the yeast for the fermentation process, once we've collected the apples, pressed the apples on site, collected the juice, we then apply a French-making wine yeast, and we cold ferment. So fermentation can take quite a long time because the yeast is acting on the sugars, the few sugars that are in our apple juice. They're acting on that sugar for quite a long period. We think this makes a much more sophisticated drink, and we can have a great amount of variety as well. So we can really play around.
It's not just cider that the Newt focus on, though. With multiple restaurants and an extensive selection of on-site produced and own-label products, including cheese, vegetables and meat, the Newt is a local food destination in its own right. It's clear to me when I'm speaking to Arthur that the health of the land plays a vital role in all of this. So I ask him to tell me more.
We have a simple sort of creed here, which is a sense of place and to leave the land in a better state than we found it. Our farmer, head of the farm, Cameron, put it really well the other day, which is that in his mind, he needs to leave the farm, he needs to leave the soil in a better position than he found it. So if you look after the soil, if you tend the soil, there's an amazing person, for any of your listeners going to want to look out, somebody called Eve Balfour, actually an ancestor of mine. She was the one who started up the Soil Association. Her ideas were all about the health of the soil, understanding the soil. If you understand the soil, then you can work towards making it healthier. Once you're making the soil healthier, you're making your crops healthier, and then your crops are making you healthier. It's not rocket science, but not everybody's getting it right.
And I think the way you talk about this too, it very much plays into food and seasonality and how that works in your restaurants. And I think seasonality and sustainability, they sort of go hand in hand. So can you tell me about this within your restaurants at the Newt and how your chefs work to do that?
Yeah, the relationship between the kitchens and the garden is akin to a symbiotic one. And if you look at the kitchens here and you look at the gardeners, those two are constantly talking with each other. When the garden team are coming up with their planting plans, they don't just operate in their own sort of small area. They sit down with the chefs and say, look, this is what we're forecasting for the weather. This is what our crop plans are looking like. How do you feel about this? And the kitchens go, well, we could use a lot of this, but we're probably not going to use very much of that. So that helps the garden then determine how much land they're going to allocate to that specific cultivar or whatever the vegetable is. It also helps to keep each other in check because, if the kitchen say, gosh, we love avocados, how about growing us an avocado tree? The horticulturist can gently let them down and say, I'm afraid we are in Somerset and we don't grow avocados here. But the kitchen can also gently guide the gardener and say, look, as good as turnips are, we don't need an awful lot of them. Could you possibly grow something else along agretti lines or whatever? We're also lucky here in that we have different growing environments and different climates. For example, we grow tomatoes 11 months of the year. We need to sum up what are the tastes for things, what can we provide that is seasonal and sustainable, but how can we influence that? We are humans. We should be able to use our technology for the good of as many stakeholders as possible, and that's what we're investigating here. How can we extend our season without, not at the detriment of the environment, but also not at the detriment of our clients?
Thanks, Monica. And that's all for this edition of The Menu. Remember that we are back with a new episode again on Friday at 2000 London time. That's at midday in San Francisco. Also, don't forget to tune into our spin-off show, Food Neighborhoods, for a tour of some of the world's tastiest destinations. I am Chiara Rimella. This programme was produced by Monica Lillis and our sound engineers were Flynn Simons and Elliot Greenfield. Thanks for listening, and until next week.